Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today. So happy you tuned in. It is the first full day of the Trump administration. I was up pretty late last night doing various media-related things and catching up with the news. I imagine you were as well.
I was. It was a long night for me. I'm sure you're celebrating the first full day of the Trump administration now, Robby.
I am in a celebratory mood. Yes.
Well, I don't know if that will be reflected in your radar or not, but Robby, what's in your radar?
Yes, indeed. Well, here's something to discuss regarding Dr. Fauci. Now, just hours before leaving office, or in some cases, mere minutes, President Joe Biden made the shocking and appalling decision, in my view, to issue preemptive pardons to a large number of people, including his family members. We'll discuss that further a little bit later in the show. But I want to take a closer look right now at the preemptive pardon he issued to Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease specialist and chief advisor to both Presidents Trump and Biden during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the text of the pardon actually contains a very important hint about the real reason that Fauci is being protected. Now, bear with me as I explain, because I think this does reveal quite a bit. Ludicrously, as one of his last acts as president, Biden did pardon Fauci, ostensibly because, as COVID has become an increasingly polarized issue, and Fauci was the public face of lockdowns, mask mandates, and vaccine requirements, Republicans are targeting him. That was Biden's purported rationale for all of these pardons. What if Trump weaponizes the justice system and engages in a witch hunt against political enemies? Now, let's set aside for a moment that is exactly what Trump supporters think that Biden's Justice Department did to Trump. The real question has to be, is there a legitimate reason to think ex-public servant did something wrong, potentially criminal, or worthy of investigating? That should be the standard. In Fauci's case, the answer to that, again, in my view, unequivocally yes. Not because Fauci recommended COVID restrictions that I oppose, not because Fauci, as he admits, made up the social distancing rules, not because Fauci advocated vaccines, any of that. It's not a crime for him to propose COVID mitigation procedures that I think went too far or were wrong-headed. The crime, potentially, is advocating that public tax dollars be spent on reckless scientific experimentation on viruses in unsafe Chinese labs and then misleading or even lying to Congress about whether he did so. That is the serious critique of Fauci, who is the foremost public advocate of gain-of-function research, the manipulation of dangerous viruses to make them more deadly and more contagious, theoretically, in order to better understand them. We do not know that such research is what caused the COVID-19 pandemic, but we do know that scientists sought grant funding to engage in exactly the kind of research that could have produced COVID-19, and they plan to do that research in Wuhan, China. Seems well worth investigating to me. Now, keep in mind that concerns about this research were never partisan to begin with. In fact, to his credit, President Barack Obama became very worried about it back in 2014. That year, Obama issued a pause on public funding of gain-of-function research, and even asked scientific teams already engaged in such research to, hey, could you cut it out on a voluntary basis? That's how concerned Obama was. Now, this news at the time received a neutral or even a favorable write-up in the New York Times, which quotes multiple infectious disease experts, not crazy right-wing people, but mainstream voices, as supporting the pause on gain-of-function research. Okay, here is where things get interesting. 2 years ago, part of a lawsuit against the Biden administration for censoring COVID-related speech, Fauci sat for a lengthy deposition and answered questions about many topics, including for gain-of-function research. You might remember I did a radar on this 2 years ago. Here was the key part. Fauci was asked whether he recalled if there was a legal exception regarding the pause on gain-of-function research from 2014. Here's what he said in response, and I'm quoting directly from his deposition. He affirmed there was such an exception. Quote, yeah, the deliberations at the time, based on the need to continue certain critical research, that an exception clause was put in saying that under special circumstances, and I'll read it so that you get an understanding, an exception from the pause may be obtained if the head of a U.S. government funding agency determines that the research is urgently needed to protect the public health or national security, end quote. Fauci was then asked whether he ever invoked that exception, since he was the head of just such a funding agency. Fauci replied, quote, as I recall, exceptions were given to a couple of experiments, end quote. Fauci went on to say he did not remember specifically signing off on the exceptions, and that it may have been done by his deputies rather than by him. The papers might have crossed his desk. He can't quite remember. Fauci's also sparred very publicly with Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who has accused the doctor of making misleading testimony before Congress about whether research he funded met the definition of gain-of-function research, which is, of course, a potentially criminal issue. Okay, keep all that in mind. The text of Biden's pardon for Fauci from yesterday states that he is being pardoned for any and all offenses he may have committed or taken part in as director of the National Institutes for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, as a member of the White House Task Force on COVID, or as chief medical advisor to the president. The pardon also contains a note on the time period it covers. This is the key fact. Note that the pardon is not confined to the time period of the pandemic when Fauci was the COVID advisor, say January 1st, 2020. It's also not backdated to encompass Fauci's entire time as the head of that institution, which stretches back to 1984. So let's be clear on this. It's neither super narrow, i.e. just covering COVID, nor is it super broad, i.e. the whole time that he's the country's top medical guy. The pardon is backdated to encompass a time period that begins January 1st, 2014. Why is that? Well, we may never know for sure, but it certainly seems suspicious to me that 2014 is the year Obama issued that pause on gain-of-function research. I wonder if that was the year that any potential wrongdoing on the part of Fauci does, in fact, originate. And I was not the only person to notice this, Niall. It was the subject of some discussion on social media. Again, I don't know if that's the reason or what this means, but it is striking to me that it's neither narrowly focused on just the time where he becomes this kind of controversial public COVID figure, 2020 and on, nor is it just all your time in, public life. It starts 2014. Yeah. That's not a new presidential year. That's not a new administration year. That's the middle of Barack Obama's second term when he announced this pause on funding.
Yeah, I think those are completely valid questions to ask. I am, as you know, not a huge fan of pardoning power or preemptive pardons generally, or of blanket pardons. Whether one would define this as a blanket pardon or not, I suppose, is debatable given the issue of the dates that you talk about. To state the very obvious, I'm not a virologist, but I did think that the gain of function debate was one of the more valid debates around the pandemic and around the handling of it. As I think we mentioned yesterday, I take a more generous view of the overall government response to the pandemic than I think you do. But the gain of function issue is a legitimate one, and I remember those congressional back and forths between Senator Paul and Fauci, and I think they were somewhat difficult to follow if you weren't pretty knowledgeable in the area, but I do think that it is obviously an important question as to whether the government funded research that could ultimately have produced inadvertently the COVID, the virus.
And I went back and listened to the radar I did on this deposition and read the transcript of what Fauci said during it, and I just do find it tremendously frustrating. Barack Obama, political figure, not someone I agree with on a lot of stuff, but the democratically elected leader of the country says, you know what, I'm a little worried about this. I think we should stop doing it. Some in the expert scientific community were agreeing with him. Again, when the New York Times covers this, it's not contentious. The New York Times interviewed scientist after scientist who was like, yeah, we should pause this. So there was an expert consensus around it. That was what the democratically elected leader of the country wanted to do. But then you get this very vague national security exception for people like Dr. Fauci, or he says his deputies. They would decide, and then maybe the paper crosses his desk, he signs it, he can't quite remember, and then they do it anyway for, again, there's this national security-sized hole. And it's not just in this context, in so many contexts where it could be law enforcement, it could be national security, it can be medical people, are still doing whatever they want to do contrary to the clear will of the people who are elected. And I think that's a big problem we talk about in the context of actual national security, of literal foreign policy, rather. Sure. And here it was raising its ugly head in this context too.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that that happens, and you're much better versed in it than I am, to the extent that that happens, obviously it's problematic. Obviously it's a legitimate grounds for inquiry. I think Fauci did receive a lot of unwarranted hostility, and there were threats to him and his family and security.
Well, I mean, he shouldn't be threatened. His family shouldn't be threatened, regardless of if he's
regardless of what. But I'm also, as I say, not a huge fan of blanket pardons.
All right, well, we're starting off the day on a note of collegiality and agreement. That is not going to last long, I guarantee you that. Lots more to get into today, and it is going to be fiery. You won't want to miss it. Stay tuned.